which dynamic EQ of 2019 is the best dynamic EQ of 2019. That's what we're going to take a look at in this video. We're going to do so by trying to answer the following questions. Does it fit in your workflow? Is the CPU hit big? Are the features provided useful? And are the features provided easy to use? We're going to use these as our criteria as opposed to doing a bunch of comparisons with sounds, because in the land of equalizers, the ones we're going to show, they can all sound excellent. They can all sound great. And so we really want to take a step back from a more subjective approach and sort of just look at some facts and see what we can gather from it. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So first off, let's see our contenders. I'm going to load each one up one at a time so you can see them and how fast they load, except for the Waves F6 because my demo ran out on the Wave F6. But actually, Wave Central loaded pretty quickly, but there's a big downside to loading Waves plugins is that you have to load up their thing and then you have to go through their list to load it up again. So loading it up for them is like a little bit extra painful versus, you know, for example, our first contender here is the FabFilter. And I load it up and bam, like that's pretty dang fast and I'm already working. You'd still be digging through menus in the Waves stuff. So that's our first contender. We also have the M Dynamic EQ, which is right here. Also loads very quickly. We have the Oxford Dynamic EQ. A little bit slower on the load time, but you know, it's there, it's there. We're gonna be taking a look at the Neutron equalizer inside from Isotope, which these have long load times. And sometimes if you have a complicated session, this can get worse. Just so you know, fair warning, a great plugin though. And we also are gonna look at the Ozone 7 equalizer. Again, a long load time. It's something with their GUIs or something, but they've actually improved recently. I've noticed they've gotten a little bit faster. So, and we also have TDR Nova. This is one I've used for a lot of stuff. Really great, loads extremely fast. Very nice. So let's take a look at the CPU load. These things put on your system. Let's load up 10 or 20 and see what it does. Now, I did one with 10, then I did one with the GUIs open, but who's gonna have 10 GUIs open? So then I closed them all and measured that. And then I did it again with 20 with the GUI open and then 20 with them closed. There was only one that I couldn't load all 20 with the GUI open. That was the Oxford Dynamic EQ. Might have been just my computer, but it continually crashed after about 13. And so I gave up on that. But if I did it with the GUIs closed, I could load all 20. So there's something with having many GUIs open with that particular plugin. It's a little weird. But here is a chart. And as you can see on our chart, Pro Q3 just owns it. Now, M Dynamic EQ also kind of owns it here as well. Next up, we're going to show off the steepest cutoff available to you in each plugin. Now, these all have the same Q setting of 1 and a cutoff at 100 Hertz. I decided to just compare the low pass cut because that's a thing that we very commonly want to do. And some of these plugins were not made to be necessarily a super intense, like the Oxford Dynamic Equalizer was certainly not meant to do this. It was meant to sort of just shape the spectrum, sort of massage it into place. And so this is a little unfair for some of them, but most of them offer quite a substantial cutoff. The Pro Q3 offers a brick wall filter, which is pretty dang sharp. It's that purple line there. TDR Nova and the M Dynamic EQ also offered extremely sharp cutoff options that are somewhat comparable. Next up, we have a graph that represents a phase shift caused by each of the equalizers. You see, when you use a filter, the way it filters it is it causes a phase shift. And this phase shift is what basically is your filter. There's actually two ways to do this. There's what's called a minimum phase, which is basically the smallest phase shift that is possible. And then you have linear phase, which is no phase shift, but it comes along with other issues such as pre-ringing, which we will look at here in a second. So here is just a chart comparing the various equalizers. And they have all been set with a Q of 1, a boost of 12 dB, and it's a peaking filter with its center frequency at 8 kilohertz. So what we really want to see from this graph is symmetry. And the one that's not symmetric is the M Dynamic Equalizer. You see how it's a little cramped on the latter half of the cycle, and then it's much longer on the first half of the cycle. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Actually, quite a few equalizers do this, It's usually a result of doing 0 latency. So we can see here that it appears to just get a little bit cramped when we EQ the high end. This isn't bad. It's just something to be aware of. If you have transients up there, they may respond quite differently because a phase shift may move a frequency that has some importance. But in the high end, usually these are all just upper harmonics, so it's not that noticeable. If you were to use this on some drums, you would notice a difference in performance when EQing with the various EQs based on this phase shift, and it's most noticeable as it approaches the Nyquist frequency. The others, you can see they continue their cycle, and then once they get past that last little line there, they all kind of sharply change. That's just because of the scaling of the graph here. So doesn't mean it's good or bad, just something to be aware of, and perhaps is a reason to grab one and try a different one out if you already have a couple of these. If you have the M Dynamic EQ, you could try grabbing Pro Q3 and just hearing the differences between them. So TDR Nova, Pro Q3, and Ozone 7 all feature different phase modes that will actually change this shift, so you can try it out and maybe you'll get a result that you like more than another. And Pro Q3 is the only one that's got it legitly implemented. The other two have it sort of hidden away in settings, and they're not called what you think they are. So they didn't do it with phase in mind is what I'm saying. They were done with some other ideas in mind as well. So inside of Pro Q3, you have a 0 latency mode, a natural phase mode, which will change the phase shift there. And we also have a linear phase mode, and linear phase has various modes here. And we're gonna look at what this means here in a second. Now, if we go into TDR Nova has these Eco, Precise, and there's actually a Precision Plus option. If you get the more recent one, that will also change the phase shifts here, but it's sort of labeled as a CPU option. But just so you know, if you're EQing the high end, you want to try something else out, try that out. You may be surprised. And then finally, if we open up Ozone 7 and we come in here, they label theirs analog and digital. Just things to be aware of when you're using your tools, you know? And these are options that at least appear in these. The others simply, I couldn't find any options like this. All right, so next up, we're going to be looking at impulse responses. We want to see how the plugin will respond to an impulse. It's got a lot of fancy names, but basically it's just a spike of 1 with a bunch of zeros. And anything that's got a linear phase will behave quite differently than something that's got a minimum phase implementation or some kind of a mix. And so let's go ahead and just take a look at some of the results here. Now, these results were all obtained by using a 100 Hertz low pass. Some of them were somewhat underwhelming, but here we go. The first one up is Pro Q3 with its various phase modes. Now, the linear phase mode, you can see, shifts it forward. This is how linear phase does its thing. This can invite pre-ringing into the signal, but sometimes this can sound quite a bit better than a minimum phase implementation. So you want to use your ears with this sort of a thing. The way it shifts forward is, of course, because it has a delay on it. And so during that delay, it does plug-in delay compensation and puts it forward. That's why you get a small ring ahead of it. And this isn't unique to Pro Q3. Anything that does linear phase is going to have to deal with this in some way. We see the 0 latency and the natural phase put the ring after, which is another reason to experiment with the different phase modes. Up next, we have TDR Nova, and here you can clearly see differences in the various CPU modes offered. And so one actually, if you go into Eco, you may run into some pre-ringing a little bit. It's kind of an interesting result here, while Precise tries to make the smearing basically as short as possible. So pretty interesting results. Did not necessarily expect this, but worth knowing when you're EQing, try out the different modes, you may hear something significant. And then the others were sort of what you see is what you get, or what you hear is what you get. And some of them did barely any filtering to the impulse at all. Now the M Dynamic, it took care of that impulse and got right away with it. So the filtering there worked really well. The Waves F6 and the Oxford at the same settings as the others were not nearly as aggressive. So this was somewhat interesting to me. You would actually need to have some more aggressive settings in order to get comparable results. Now this can be a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe you're going in and you want to just subtly change things. Then that might be one reason to grab the Oxford EQ. If you go online and actually look at reviews for the Oxford Dynamic EQ, you'd be surprised at the number of people who swear they really like the sound of this plugin. This may be why. You may have just a little bit more fine control over it, while the others are sort of just aggressive out the get-go. So worth taking note of. Finally, we have Ozone 7, which has a linear phase filter built in, and you can see its impulse there, which is a kind of strange looking impulse. Again, not too much filtering though. There's not a lot of smearing, which is probably why it works so well. You'd have to be quite a bit more aggressive in order to get similar results. As far as a winner for this section, Pro Q3 definitely takes the cake, as it offers the most variety and actually labels things what they are. TDR is a close second for having very similar options. Okay, so up next, we're going to be looking at the plugins that support equal gain, gain compensation, auto gain. There's a bunch of names for this thing, but what it does basically is when you make an EQ adjustment, we humans tend to hear things that get boosted as better because it's louder, and we hear things more evenly as things get louder. And so we say, oh, that sounds really nice. But this is not always so, and it can lead to loss of headroom and a bunch of other problems. And so having an auto gain setting to check your loudness, so what it does basically is it will make adjustments to make one as loud as it was before. And what this allows you to do is make actual comparisons that have quite a bit more meaning to your mix. And so in Pro Q3, there's just a little auto button here, just to give you an example. So here I have a sound. And what we're going to do is we're just going to put a enormous boost right here with the auto gain on. It sounds like this. A similar loudness if we turn it off. And now we're also clipping. So you can hear the auto gain doing its job. And this is just a great way to actually compare the spectrum. Like, did we actually like what it was doing? So there's quite a few that have this option. TDR Nova has it. As we can see here, there's an EQ gain button, which will do a similar thing. Ozone 7 also has it. You got the little ear here. I kind of appreciate that. And the M Dynamic EQ also has it in here. It is the AGC button, auto gain compensation. The others don't have it. So you just got to be more aware when you're EQing with those. Now let's look at multi-channel EQing. So this is a big one that Pro Q3 just stomps all over a lot of other people with because they are so much better than the other options. So here, for example, if I wanted to do a EQ that EQs the left channel and the right channel independently, what I would have to do is I'd have to open up one of these. Like, let's just say I take TDR Nova and I say, oh, okay, I'd like this one. Or maybe you want to do a mid-side thing, you know, whatever floats your boat. I could come in here and I could say, hey, take this and we'll EQ maybe mono, stereo, some difference left or right. So I make it just left or I make it just right. And then I do my equalizing, and then I open up a second channel, notice second dynamic EQ, and then I do my equalizing for, if this was left, then I do it for the right. And that just kind of, you know, stinks because that's a lot of additional routing and work. And also you need an entirely separate instance to even do this. And the same thing for sum and difference. So instead, Pro Q3 has an ingenious way of doing this. It's done per band as well. This just gets insane real quick. So if I click here and drag up, and I could say, okay, I want to EQ this, but we could see here, my left channel is super different from my right channel. So I say, you know what? I want to EQ this differently. So I'm going to hit the little scissor tool for this band, and it splits it into a right channel and a left channel. Let's say, oh, I want my left to have a lot more low end, and I want to remove some high end from the right channel. And I'm like, listen to that. That's amazing. That's right there. Not only can you do this, you can actually come in here and you can select stereo, mid, side. You can do the whole shebang. This actually also supports surround sound. So this workflow is incredibly fast. You only need one instance and it's all just right there. So this is amazing. This wins hands down of the ones that we have here. The next thing I'm going to show is also a feature that is in other dynamic EQs, but Pro Q3 does it especially well. And that is the feature of spectrum grab. So a lot of times you have like a vocal or something coming in and you want to analyze it, find the peaks and just bring those peaks down because you want to get rid of the resonant frequencies. And you can do this with other EQs by just turning up how long it has a hold time for. So you just turn the peak hold time, the spectrum will float there for a while and you can drag a filter in and do your EQing, but it's just not all that elegant. Now, Neutron has tried to resolve this by use of AI. So if I open up Neutron here, so here's a Neutron, and what you can do is you can actually go to Track Assistant, and we should have been playing something while this was going. So let's play it, and we'll hit Track Assistant. You can see it making changes, adjusting. And we can see the moves it's made. And a lot of people use this as a starting point. It's kind of nice, like, oh, it found some sort of a peak. It decided instead of putting a filter there, it made it a dynamic band there. So we're compressing there. And we've set a little bit of a really shallow low pass. You know, we've got some things, or low cut. So what Pro Q3 does is along similar veins. So in Pro Q3, all you do is you play your audio and you just hover your mouse over the spectrum, and it will eventually just show you those problem areas, and you can simply click and drag and it will make a filter there to get rid of the resonances. So this is just a super smooth integration into your workflow for things you already want to do anyway. So if I go ahead and play it, hover, and we can see, oh, it thinks these are the peaks. And after looking at it, we say, oh, we've got one here, so we'll just add a filter there. And let's grab another. So say, oh, let's take down this 3 kilohertz. And away we go. We've removed some of the resonances in there. Now, this piece of audio isn't all that bad, but some of them, you know, this can be an incredibly fast and easy way to do things, and it's very precise. Okay, so up next is the ability to see multiple instances. So this is really useful if you want to see where 2 spectrums are overlapping so that you can remove masking. Now, not all masking is bad, but there is some masking that is definitely not good. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that here. Now, there's a couple that support this, but again, the 2 notable ones that do this in a way that sort of makes sense in a workflow is Pro Q3 and Neutron again. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, there is a pace analysis feature inside of the M dynamic equalizer, but it's nowhere near like this. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come over to my kick. I'm gonna slap on a Pro Q3, and there we go. And next I'm gonna come over to my snare, and I'm also gonna slap on a Pro Q3. And we can name our instances and whatnot. I'm not gonna bother with that. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say, hey, analyzer, I want you to show me the Pro Q2 setting here. And so there we go. And I'm gonna come in here and I'm going to go analyzer. You know what? I think I am gonna name it. So I'm just gonna name this snare so we can see things a little more clearly. And I wanna see the kick in this one. So that's our original Pro Q. And over here, we'll see that this changed to snare. So we've added snare in. So now if we play it, we can look at our 2 spectrums and see where they're overlapping in this mess right now. So we can see that the red's the snare, the purple is our original kick. And what we're gonna do now is we're going to turn on masking. So if we have this red on, it'll actually show us where things are colliding. Now we see here, the kick and the snare aren't really fighting each other too much. But what is fighting it is we have that crazy bass sound. So let's go ahead, let's add another dynamic equalizer, and let's put that on the bass, which is right here. So we'll put whoops, I started typing bass. We'll put another Pro Q3. And here I'm going to rename this one too to bass. And let's look at the collisions here. And we should see some red lines where they are colliding. Oh, whoops, we need to add it to our mix. So we're gonna use bass instead. So let's do this comparison. So you can see right here and a little bit up here, we've got some offending frequencies. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come over to our bass and I'm just gonna remove some of that. And let's add this Oh, by the way, you can actually see your spectrums here and you can actually see them as well. This is just super nice touch. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna just turn on the original. This is our kick drum. I should name it. Let's go ahead and name it. So we're gonna just make a cut. And just make some room for our kick to come through. And that's it. So that's the ability to use multiple instances. Really nice. Let me really quick show you a similar thing with Neutron. So if I delete this and instead let's put a Neutron here. Neutron. And we are going to name this one bass again as soon as it loads. See, this is the loading thing, man. That's so important to me. And we'll load up another Neutron. especially when they expect you to load like several so they can see each other, like, you know. But, you know, it is what it is. They do have the AI thing that's pretty cool. And I'm going to name this one kick. And we want this to tell the masking, and we want to use the base instance. So it's going to tell us where the masking's at. We can actually adjust it all within one. So we can actually close this one. And we can just look at the kick. We can actually adjust them. And now if we make an adjustment in one, we have what's called an inverse link. So if we click that, it'll actually do the opposite in the other. Now, usually I just want to cut one, but every now and then, it's a pretty cool option to have. So let's go ahead and play this. You see we've got a collision down there. So let's go ahead and cut some of this out on the base. And a lot more of the kick just comes right on through. So that's also how you could do this with Neutron. The others don't really have an option like this. All right, now this is another just Pro Q3 thing. I'm not gonna lie here. Pro Q3 is pretty dank in a lot of ways because of the way they've just made it so simple. One of the things that Pro Q3 can do is it can grab a profile of anything. So here I have two very different drum loops. They sound like this. It's also a tad hot, so let's bring that down some. And now I have a second drum loop, sounds like this. And I want this one's sound, I like this sound on this one, to get put on this one. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put an EQ. So right now this is going into track 2 and this one's going into track 1. So I'm gonna move this into track 1 so they're both in the same track. And I'm gonna take this Pro Q here and I'm going to tell it to analyze this guy and create an EQ curve for it. And the way I'm going to tell it to do that is I'm going to come down here and go to EQ match. Now I'm going to tell it to use the input. That's what I want it to match. And you'll see an EQ contour pop up after I hit this record and turn that record off. And then I'm going to hit match. It will create a line. So let me just show you. So here's our line. Let it go for a while. It's figuring out what it should be. Now I'm gonna hit match. Okay, so what we have here is a line that it thinks matches the average of this EQ contour. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring up the resolution, because we can, and I'm gonna hit finish. And now I have this really specific line. Now you don't need to be this specific, and a lot of times general strokes will work, but I'm just showing you that it is possible here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move, let me move this down. I'm going to move this back to track 2, just so everything's back where it was. And let's listen to our loop first without this on. And now I will turn it on. Now, it's not a massive difference here, right? Because all these are so close together. So maybe we want to exaggerate it to show the EQ contour a bit better. So we can actually just select them all and turn the gain up. And now we can compare the before and after a lot more clearly. Also, it'd probably be wise to put on our auto gain here. That way the compared spectrum has been compensated for. So before, after. So that is the EQ match. Resizable. Resizable is a big deal. If I can't resize my stuff, I have problems because a lot of times I'm working on a laptop and not a lot of screen space. Pro Q3 is resizable, but not resizable in the sense you're probably thinking. So if I click down here, I have like a mini view, a small, so it's not like something I can continually drag. TDR Nova, M Dynamic EQ, and the Oxford Dynamic EQ are all resizable in the sense that you're probably thinking of, where you can just drag and move them around. Ozone, Neutron, and unfortunately Ozone, because that interface is massive. Ozone, Neutron, and the Waves F6 cannot be resized. As far as ergonomics go, plugins that are really ergonomic, Pro Q3 wins this again, hands down, just because when you click, the thing that you want shows up, and when you don't want that thing, it disappears and you're given your spectrum. Like, things are where they should be. Everything is everything behaves the exact way you'd want it to behave. Other plugins such as TDR Nova just have standard knobs that don't dynamically behave like the Pro Q3 does. And so they're not as ergonomic, especially towards screen space. But also, how great would it be if the spectrum analyzer was like a nice full spectrum analyzer instead of, you know, having to sacrifice half of it for controls. So that's a thing that's also really nice. Just something to be aware of. Personally, I like the look of most of these plugins, but it is nice when things show up and disappear when they should in an incredibly fluid way. Now, you saw me do a thing with the multi-filter selection in Pro Q3. That is a thing that you cannot do in every single one. So the ones that support multi-filter selection are Pro Q3, TDR Nova, Waves F6, Ozone, and Neutron. The Oxford Dynamic EQ and the M Dynamic EQ do not support multi-filter selection. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal, but as you can see, sometimes it can be a pretty handy thing. Also, TDR Nova has a swankin' option. If you come in here and let's say I move this on this side and I hit order by frequency, it'll reorder them so that the numbers line up on the interface. That is amazing. So that's very welcome feature. Very, very cool. Here are the prices the developers publish that they want you to pay. Now, some of them have some really aggressive sales, like Waves is always doing big sales, so you can actually get some of these for much cheaper. But assuming they actually expect you to pay this much, this is how much they would want you to pay. Now, the winner for this category is actually TDR Nova because it's got an extremely functional free version, like extraordinarily usable. So you just can't beat free. For me, when it comes to comparing prices with features, I think that the Pro Q3 is the clear winner. It's just got so many additional things. It's intuitive. The CPU footprint is extremely light. They've got several things that others just don't have, and they're all integrated in such a smooth, convenient way that I think it's completely worth it. And finally, we have a wonderful little chart with a bunch of yes, no, easy to see at a glance comparison, and you can make a decision for yourself on what is the most well-built equalizer. So in conclusion, what's the best dynamic equalizer of 2019? I'd have to give it to Pro Q3. There's just way too much going for it. It wins by quite a bit. I think the margin is quite large, in my opinion. What do you think? Drop it down below. Subscribe and have a blessed day.